Hi everybody, welcome back to part 4 of Wally Wood's 22 panels that always work. We're almost done, only 5 panels left to go. In the previous videos, I pointed out that Wood was influenced by street photography. And in this video, I'd like to take a moment and talk about another major influence on his art, cinema. Because cinema happens in real time, it had to develop shots that photography and illustration didn't have to explore. And early on, the camera was just locked down on a wide shot and all the action had to pass through the frame. But filmmakers began to experiment and they invented a whole new way to tell stories. By the 1920s, a complete catalog of visual storytelling techniques had been developed, and in the film world they called this camera blocking. A quick definition of camera blocking is basically the placement of the camera in regards to the actors or the action. Wood uses these same camera blocking techniques in his art to tell stories. Here's some examples of early 20th century cinema, and you can see for yourself how they compare with Wood's panels. Wood was an assistant to Will Eisner, and Eisner was a huge proponent of using cinema techniques in comics. And this may be one of the reasons why the Iger and Eisner studio became one of the leading independent packagers of comics in the late 30s and early 40s. Another thing that I found in Wood's art is that from time to time, he does what I would call progression panels. In these progression panels, he basically draws a series of near identical panels, but each panel has a slight change to it. This technique gives the readers the feel of action over a very quick or short period of time, and for dramatic effect, he puts these panels in a single row across the page. I believe that this is one of those techniques that Wood learned from Will Eisner, but again, it's very cinema-inspired. Movies and TV also motivated Wood in other ways, and a great example of this is the Thunder Agents. The Thunder Agents were created when Wood and his friend Len Brown got the idea to mix superheroes with secret agents, and this came about because both men loved James Bond and TV shows like The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and The Avengers. By the way, who didn't love Emma Peel? Anyway, I digress. Let's move on where we left off from last time. The next panel is called Frame. I think this is another one of those techniques borrowed from photography and cinema. Wood uses windows, doors, trees, or shadows as a natural frame inside his drawings. And by doing this, he puts emphasis on the subject inside the frame. Wood does this anytime in his stories. It's sort of a catch-all panel. This panel can do a lot. One thing it can do is it can act as an establishing shot, establishing time and location. And you can sort of see what it can do, and here's some examples of it in action. Panel number 19 is White Ben Day background and silhouette. This is another way Wood builds depth. It's very similar to the open panel, and it's very similar to the silhouettes we've seen before. We've seen this technique and what it does, and here's some examples of it. I won't go into too much more detail. We'll talk more about it when we get to the panel called Contrast that's coming up. I debated a long time about starting off this series of videos with this panel. This concept plays a major part in Wood's artwork. It's called the 3-stage panel. When I first saw the drawing on the reference sheet, I thought Wood was talking about 3-point perspective, but when I started looking at it, I realized that's not what he's talking about at all. Wood uses the term stages, so instead of using that term, it might be easier for all of us to think of this in a more modern term, and that term would be layering. If you do Photoshop or make graphics in some other software, you probably already understand the concept of breaking everything down into layers. But for those of you who don't understand this, what Wood is doing is that he's drawing the items in the picture on different planes or levels, and then he's sort of stacking the items in the picture on top of each other, and he does this to create depth and distance. Ultimately, what Wood means by 3 stages is that the panel should have 3 layers of distance. In his drawings, there's a foreground layer, a midground layer, and a background layer. Okay, so here's a real simple example of it. Daredevil and the edge of the building make up the foreground. The buildings behind him are the midground layer, and the sky is the background layer. This is a very basic example, but sometimes he gets a little more complex by having multiple midground layers. And here's a far more complicated example from Mad Magazine. The woman walking and the sound effects are the foreground layer. Now, this is where it gets complicated. The midground layer is actually made up of multiple layers, and this is what creates the additional distance and depth on the page. The first midground layer is made up of the blowing papers, bats, and the streetlight. And by trailing off the papers and bats in size, Wood creates additional distance inside the layer. The next midground layer is made up of buildings, and if you pay real close attention to them, you can see that they have detail on them. You can see the bricks, the shingles, the window panes, and things like that. Now, if you look past those buildings into the buildings behind them, those buildings have no detail on them. They're sort of blurry and out of focus. You can see the shapes, but not much more in the way of detail. Anyway, the buildings are blurry, and the blurriness increases as the buildings go further back into the distance. That blurriness created in the distance is called bokeh. And this obviously probably comes from Wood's studying of photography. In Wood's day, and for that matter the first 100 years of photography, there was no name for this. Photographers sort of acknowledged it, but they never really gave it a name or made a big deal out of it. It was just a thing that happened because of the type of lens you used, or the aperture setting, or the focal point. There's a lot of things that can create this. Sometime in the late 80s and early 90s, Japanese photographers noticed this and began doing all sorts of cool things with this blurriness in the background. They came up with the term bokeh, and some people pronounce it bokeh. Either way is acceptable. The meaning comes from the Japanese words meaning haziness and half asleep or half being there. A couple of other things I want to point out on this splash page. We have overlapping bats on the title text, which also creates depth. This drawing also has the dark, gloomy, mysterious background, and you might remember I talked about tenebrism way back in the first part of this series on Wally Wood, and here's a great example of tenebrism. The woman walking is clashing against the dark background, and we can also see that the lighting is uneven on her, and he puts highlights and shadows on her form. And this goes back to the chiaroscuro technique that I talked about, I believe, in the second part of this series. I especially love the clock in the background. It's on the out-of-focus building, and because it's on the out-of-focus building, it's drawing your attention to it. It's a great storytelling technique because it's letting you know that it's almost midnight, the witching hour, and only bad things happen during that time. 2 more panels and we're done. You've almost made it. Another great storytelling technique Wood does is that he creates panels where he uses newspaper headlines. And visually, this is a great way to reveal information to the reader. But if you do a deep dive on Wood's stories, you realize that he uses various forms of media as a way to reveal information, and not just to the reader. He uses media to reveal information to his characters, and that way his characters can react to the information that's being presented to them. This way, his characters can react to new information that's being presented through the media. Oh no, it's an alien invasion. Oh no, a psychopathic killer is on the loose. It's a real-time approach that can create drama in a story. And in his stories, characters find out what's going on through radio, television, or even slideshow presentations. Back in Wood's day, newspaper headlines was a quick way to push the narrative, but newspapers don't have the impact on society that they once did, so for our modern times, we might think of things like cell phones, podcasts, and computer screens. Using media is a great storytelling technique, and it's a way to push the narrative without using narration boxes or cutting away to another location or group of characters. Finally, we're at the last panel. Yay! And this panel is another one of those multi-purpose concepts, and it's simply called contrast. It can be used for creating depth on an object in a panel. It can also be used to set mood and atmosphere. And if you look over this page, you can see the various ways that Wood uses contrast. I'd like to focus on a couple of examples of this from Wood's EC Comics days. And if you take a look at this panel, the panel on the left is using contrast to set the mood. It's sort of a film noir kind of look to it, and there's a sense of doom and gloom about it. What's amazing is the very next panel to it contrast serves a totally different purpose. This time, contrast is used in a way to give depth to the picture. The shadows on the cabin and the bottom side of the flying saucer create depth. There's also contrast between the trees and the mountains in the background, and it all adds to a sense of space and distance in the panel. It's sort of amazing because he's using contrast in two different terms, literally in the panels next to each other. And by the way, contrast isn't limited to darks and lights. You can also have contrast through color. And here's a great example of it. By filling the cockpit with reds and oranges, these warm colors contrast against the cooler blue colors in the background. Going back to the framing panel, the reds and oranges form a frame and put emphasis on the spaceship. You might also notice that those colors also form a L shape that we've seen throughout Wood's artwork. Well, that's about it for Wally Wood's 22 panels that always work. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Wood's art. I can tell you that I really enjoyed doing the research on this, and I learned quite a bit. I know it's going to help me make better comics, and I hope it will do the same for you. Before I go, I'd like to send out a really big shout out to comic pro artist Loston Wallace. He's done work for DC, Marvel, and IDW, and he's been viewing this series on Wally Wood's panels, and he's been making some comments about it. He mentioned that Wally Wood was a really big influence on his artwork, and he also mentioned that he did the variant covers to Mars Attacks Firstborn. This was a series published by IDW, and I believe it came out in 2014. As most of you might know, Wally Wood was the co-creator of Mars Attacks card series way back in 1962. And over the years, it's been turned into a franchise with movies, comics, and other merchandise. So, paying tribute to Wally Wood, Loston based his cover designs on Wood's EC comic covers from the 1950s. Wow. That's really cool. Great job, Loston. By the way, I just ordered the series and I can't wait to take a look at it. Please remember to hit that like button, and if you're making comics, whether you're a pro with years of experience like Loston, or someone like me who makes comics for fun, please make comments about the panels we covered in this video in the section down below. And as a learning tool, your insights are greatly appreciated, and not just by me, but by all those who are interested in creating comics. So, that's about it for me. I hope to have some new superhero documentaries out soon. I've got some great characters lined up that many of you may never have heard of. And I'm also cleaning up some of the bad audio on some of my older videos, so expect to see them being relaunched soon. That's it for me. So until next time, stay super. Bye.